Ever wonder why it's so difficult to land that first contract or get a new agency to consider your proposals? It seems like no matter how qualified you are or how absolutely perfect your company would be to fulfill an advertised requirement, the job always goes to someone else. In today's discussion on shaping federal procurements, we'll examine why that happens and how to get your company on the winning side of that equation. Growthmasters Federal is a nationwide community of growth-oriented government contractors, their executive teams, and the professionals who support them. The purpose is to share experiences and discuss timely topics on planning and executing the most effective growth strategies in the very challenging but opportunity-rich federal marketplace. We're broadcasting live from our studio near Washington, D.C., and we welcome our viewers from around the country. We're also recording this webinar, so you may be watching a moderated rebroadcast or on demand. If you're watching a moderated presentation, we invite you to submit your questions using the tools on your screen. Otherwise, please send your questions by email to questions@scaletomarket.com or give us a call at the number listed here. Registered viewers will receive an email with a link to view the webinar on demand and a brief survey asking for your feedback on the presentation. Please take a minute to reply and tell us what you think so we can serve you better in the future. Your host for today's presentation is Shirley Collier. Shirley is the president and founder of Scale to Market and has been working in the federal sector as an entrepreneur, author, speaker, and consultant for over 25 years. Enjoy the presentation.
Hello, this is Shirley. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion on how to ethically and legally shape upcoming federal procurements. After selling my last government contracting business in 2012, I decided to focus on what I enjoy the most, helping senior executives with strategic planning. But what I found is that most small businesses really struggle with business development, especially in the complex, highly regulated federal sector. So I figured that if I could help my clients solve the business development riddle and bring in more revenue, then there would be capital to invest in the business. Now I come in through the business development door, but take a very holistic CEO perspective on all the plates that must be kept spinning for sustainable, profitable growth. Today we're going to be discussing what the federal regulations really say about pre-solicitation communications between government decision makers and influencers, such as program offices, small business offices, and regulatory agencies, and industry. We'll examine in detail the framework for successful communications, what situations and circumstances to avoid, and we'll end by detailing the guidelines successful contractors use when meeting with government representatives. And just a reminder, if you're listening to a moderated presentation, I encourage you to submit questions as we proceed. If not, please email your questions to us at questions@scaletomarket.com, and we'll respond promptly. Our discussion today falls within the business development best practices we've identified that help government contractors grow and prosper. Those 4 best practices are: first, have a data-driven, customized business development plan, or as I like to call it, a BD playbook. Second, hire good people for your business development team, then delegate authority to them. Third, clearly articulate a vision for the company, both internally and externally, to ensure alignment of the BD effort and operations. And finally, regularly and honestly evaluate your playbook, make adjustments, and don't hesitate to pivot with the ever-changing marketplace. Today's topic on shaping upcoming procurements is a critical part of the BD playbook best practice. There are many misunderstandings by contractors and federal employees involved in the acquisition process about how to engage in legal, ethical pre-solicitation communications with one another, beginning with the fact that it is possible, legal, and actually encouraged by the FAR, or the Federal Acquisition Regulations. We give this webinar frequently to clear up some of these misunderstandings so both contractors and the federal government can benefit from enhanced communications as envisioned by the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, or OFPP, and as articulated in the FAR. So why does the government allow their people to talk to vendors prior to issuing public solicitations? They have learned that not doing it because of fear of protest or just plain old risk avoidance results in less competition and higher prices. Government employees are also less productive because they are not using the commercial resources that are available to them. Ultimately, it has been demonstrated that results are just not as good if procurement officials work in a vacuum. The second thing the government has learned is that being non-communicative is a huge barrier to entry by new vendors. It discourages companies from approaching the government with new ideas and innovations, which consequently results in less competition and higher prices. Their conclusion, as stipulated in the FAR, is that government and industry can work together prior to the bidding process without compromising the integrity of the procurement system, and they should in fact work together for the sake of better outcomes for the government. If you care to read the legalese, FAR 15.201 spells out in detail how government and industry can engage in pre-solicitation communications. The opening chapter of the FAR acknowledges that fairness and openness cannot exist without open communications. Therefore, it encourages effective communications between government and industry. We will summarize these regulations in this presentation. The OFPP has put out several official memos to government employees to clarify the regulations and encourage more interactions with industry. They are entitled Myth-Busting Memos and began coming out in 2011. These memos stated that, contrary to popular belief by a lot of government employees and contractors alike, one-on-one meetings are lawful. Statistics show that communications with vendors actually lowers the probability of protest, as opposed to increasing it as some contracting personnel think. These pre-solicitation discussions allow contractors to provide valuable information to program and contracting personnel. Industry days and conferences are valuable for government personnel as well as vendors, and two-way communications during these events is encouraged. Vendor information exchanges with program and contracting officials are more productive than just looking at general marketing materials or browsing websites, which is what some government officials do. The OFPP myth-busting memos also state unequivocally that early and specific input from industry is helpful and beneficial to the procurement process as a whole, and that broad participation, meaning reaching out to businesses of all sizes, is encouraged. Adoption of these standards was slow, so another important clarification on pre-solicitation communications with vendors was embedded 5 years later in the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, Section 887. It requires the FAR Council to clarify the regulations and encourage government to have productive lawful exchanges with vendors. It reiterated that one-on-one meetings are lawful and that the government wants innovation. And finally, that the regulations in support of the laws passed by Congress require the government to conduct market research prior to requesting proposals. We're going to pause here for a moment to allow our moderators to catch their breath and to review the questions that have been submitted so far. We'll be back shortly, so stay tuned.
Now would be a great time to submit a question or a comment. Today's presentation is brought to you by Scale to Market, and your host is Shirley Collier. Scale to Market helps businesses think, plan, collaborate, and prosper in the federal marketplace by developing and executing data-driven business development playbooks. We encourage you to visit our website, www.scaletomarket.com, for additional resources. Now back to our webinar on shaping future federal procurements.
Hello and welcome back. Let's take a look now at the framework, the who, when, why, what, and how for successful communications so you can be assured you are doing it correctly. The people involved in pre-solicitation communications are government contractors, end users, like requirements analysts and program personnel, contracting office folks like the contracting officer, contracting specialists, contracting office representatives or CORs, contracting office technical representatives or COTARs, support personnel, and others such as the small business office staff. As to when these communications can take place, they may begin even before a requirement is officially identified, all the way through receipt of proposals. If you have a product or service an agency may benefit from, you may and are encouraged to talk to them about it, even if they have not officially released a requirement for that product or service. Educating government personnel on innovations that serve the public good is a good thing. Planting seeds is a good thing. Once an RFP has been released, the communication is public, meaning that all questions from vendors and their answers from government personnel are posted for all bidders to see. But until the RFP is released, one-on-one communications between government and industry are ethical and legal. And of course, the why was stated earlier. It helps the government by increasing competition and lowering prices. So what can be discussed? The contract type, whether it's going to be an LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable, fixed priced, or cost plus contract. The contract terms and conditions. Is it going to be a 1-year contract, a 3-year contract, a set aside, full and open? The schedule for the procurement can be discussed. When will the RFI or SSN come out? When will the RFP be issued? How long will vendors have to respond? And the feasibility of the requirements can also be discussed. Through early communications that might in the private sector be termed brainstorming sessions, the government defines a requirement to their vendor community and the vendors respond with opinions on the challenges, possible solutions, and cost estimates. This informs the government on vendors' capabilities, which in turn can be used in the solicitation when it is issued. These types of communications have been happening for many decades between government agencies and large, deeply entrenched contractors such as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, IBM, and the like. But we encourage small businesses to do the same. Small businesses can have significant value propositions to offer the federal government. As far as what can be discussed, sometimes the specific statement of work or performance work statement is available for review, consultation, and comment by the vendor community. Data requirements are frequently discussed by vendors with the government, especially in the IT industry, where open source and cloud-based solutions are common. Input or feedback on the procurement process itself is sometimes the topic of discussions. Sometimes the government desires to get feedback on the upcoming proposal's instructions that are in draft form. The government is notorious for giving obtuse instructions that only people inside that specific branch of government can possibly understand. So getting feedback, especially from new bidders, can be very helpful to the government, so they in turn can clarify instructions to bidders. Contractors can also advise the government on what supporting documentation would be helpful to the vendor community to produce an accurate bid. And of course, there are a plethora of concerns the contracting community may have about the upcoming procurement, ranging from personnel qualifications to set aside and teaming requirements. These are all legitimate pre-solicitation communications. Finally, how does the vendor community ethically and legally communicate with government personnel? Well, there are a number of venues and media. At conferences, which are becoming more commonplace, as contracting office personnel shrink in number, it is nearly impossible for them to meet with every possible bidder. Many conferences have matchmaking sessions, which can be the first step to getting a one-on-one meeting scheduled. Check with the agency well in advance to see if they are conducting vendor outreach sessions and get your spot on the list early. For larger procurements, agencies often conduct public hearings or industry days to communicate requirements and answer questions. Now, there's less of an opportunity to give advice in that setting, of course, but these networking opportunities should not be missed. As we stated earlier, government procurement officials are required to conduct market research. One of the purposes of that research is to determine whether, quote, commercial items are viable solutions to agency requirements. If you are not already familiar with this term, we have a podcast dedicated to that important topic. We're going to see more emphasis on procuring commercial items in the coming years as the Amazon bill, approved by the 2018 NDAA, becomes a reality. In some cases, as in the private sector, government agencies are unaware that they have a requirement for a specific capability until they have been educated about its availability and its benefits. Being educated about industry trends, technologies, and innovations is an important part of their market research. Typically, this market research is in the form of one-on-one meetings, phone calls, draft RFPs, RFIs, or SSNs, source of salt notifications, and site visits. Now, let's examine organizational conflicts of interest, which is where the legal rubber meets the marketing road, so to speak, in this discussion. OCI is defined as unfair competitive advantage based on unequal access to beneficial competitive information. It's important to distinguish between paid advice and unpaid advice. If you are paid by the government for advice or assistance on developing requirements, you are prohibited from making an offer to perform those requirements in the resulting contract. However, FAR 9.505-2 states that when contractors are acting as industry representatives to help government agencies to prepare, refine, or coordinate specifications that are under government supervision and control, no OCI exists. Acquisition professionals will generally seek and receive information from several competitors, and the acquisition professionals are solely responsible for crafting the final statement of work or performance work statement. This kind of unpaid input is permitted and encouraged by federal regulations, even though the acquisition folks understand that contractors will engage in active selling while providing other generic, useful information to the government. There are definitely things that should be avoided, and most of these are common sense. Providing favors of any kind in exchange for bidding information should be avoided. Conflicts of interest or the appearance of conflicts of interest by government personnel or contractors. Any kind of impropriety or bias, I know this is pretty general, but just a heads up for these situations to avoid protest down the road. And finally, preferential treatment or collusion that might give your company an unfair competitive advantage should be avoided. The government is not allowed to share with vendors proprietary information that is submitted by other vendors, including cost information or proprietary intellectual property. Be sure to mark all your documentation appropriately and watch our webinar on protecting your intellectual property. And acquisition professionals must ensure equal access by all bidders to beneficial competitive information regarding the upcoming procurement. So you're not going to get a competitive edge in that regard. Successful contractors understand how to engage legally, ethically, and openly in pre-solicitation conversations with program and contract officials to better position their company's products and services for acquisition. You can do the same. Okay, let's recap some of the issues we've discussed by outlining the guidelines to follow in communicating with the federal agency and preparing for a pre-solicitation meeting. An essential first step to obtaining a one-on-one meeting with a government requirements or contracting official is to have a valid, in-depth understanding of the agency's needs and procurement processes and to express that knowledge succinctly in your communications. Avoid sales pitches, but articulate your differentiators and value proposition. Briefly describe your product or service's features and benefits and your company's skills and competencies within the context of that agency's needs. Include metrics, case studies, and other validation of your assertions. The biggest mistake I see government contractors make is using flowery or vague language to describe their competencies, their knowledge, their intellectual property, or their past performance. You have to be specific or you won't be believed. Remember, it's not about you, it's about them. Bring your technical folks and describe your previous work, how you performed it, and what the impact was to the client agency. Let the technical discussions happen, but stay in control of the discussion and focus on how your business can uniquely meet the future needs of the agencies. And the last best practice is to stay in touch with government decision makers and influencers year-round. Send newsletters, tweets, links to blogs, white papers, announcements, invitations to events, and post on LinkedIn and Facebook. It is your opportunity and responsibility to imprint your brand in the minds of government officials. You don't want your proposal to be the first time they are hearing of you. This concludes today's presentation. I hope you've picked up a few tidbits on how to ethically and legally shape upcoming federal procurements.
Thank you for joining us today. If you would like access to an on-demand version of this webinar to share with others, please email us at questions@scaletomarket.com. Subscribe to the Growth Masters Federal Podcast channel on our website at scaletomarket.com. Registered webinar participants are also entitled to a free 45-minute business development consultation with Mrs. Collier. Contact us to make those arrangements. If we did not answer your questions today, please send them to questions@scaletomarket.com and we will respond quickly. Join us again soon for another informative Growth Masters Federal presentation.